I think we are good to start. Recording is already going. I'll just trim off the front end of it. No worries. So if you want to introduce yourself, Fred, and go ahead and take his first spin.
Hey guys, I'm Fred. I'm a PowerShell automation consultant doing code management and large-scale PowerShell projects, usually infrastructure work. Meaning I usually work with PowerShell internals and less with managing a specific product. I get called into many things. And in my hobby, I'm working on, well, more PowerShell, occasional reading, occasional cocktail mixing. Hope you're having a great Hope you had a great day. And let's get this started. One of the things I usually am fussed about is how people manage their code. Source control, automation, and most particularly configuration. When you try to manage code, you can, for example, for a command, you can add a parameter. Just tell it how it should execute things. Now, this has diminishing returns at some point. Specifically, one of my main pain points is Metalevel poisoning. Have you ever encountered a command that had like 40 parameters? 50? 60? My personal record is, well, 92. They wanted me to fix a command with 92 parameters. Yes, what was happening was they were using an internal command, which was using an internal command, which was using an internal command, and they were using several of those. And they passed through all parameters in order to control how the code would execute, so they could fine-tune the original code. Yes, at some point, usability suffers. Another thing I'm seeing again and again is in CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous deployment solutions. We have scripts, we have sources, we've got input from many pieces of code on large projects, multiple modules involved, and they all, have their own configuration, their own way to do things, call by parameter, give me this configuration file, set an environment variable. It's painful. They usually have the strict requirement that everything should be part of source control, because if your configuration is not part of the source, painful. But it's spread out and difficult to manage. And then, and this is one of the main killers for me, there are lots of pieces of code running in PowerShell actually that do not have parameters. For example, readline events, you might know about the PS readline module in PowerShell, or you could add custom key bindings. Let me grab one of those now that I have to restart my console. Screen. Now, I'm a highly convenience-focused person, and I don't like typing much. For example, I'm going to hit Shift and white space. What I did, I added a key binding to expand aliases. Now, while this is convenient, I can't really specify a parameter for a key binding. And while we're at it, getting some help, again, not really parameterizable. Background tasks that happen somewhere on your system, or even you have an automatic module import, you can't parameterize it, or automated events. There are actually quite a few things that just need configuration. You can't parameterize them, you have to control how they execute. Now, option one is to specify environment variables. Now, I'm not necessarily talking about system environment variables, but instead you could be running you could set a global variable for path underscore server, and your module or your code might pick up on that. That works technically. If you query for that, you might already know about the automatic error action preference variable. They work kind of like that. The problem is they're fiendishly hard to document. Or rather, users have to look up somewhere what they should be placing, where they should be placing it. And if you have one accident with your tab completion, you might actually override it, so they're not robust. All aspects that make this not ideal from a user experience and from a developer experience. And they have some limitations. For example, they only work in your current run space if you want to multi-thread. Not quite as convenient. Easily break down. Now, option 2 is we go with configuration commands. With a command that sets an option. One of my most favorite examples for this is the out-of-the-box PS readline commands. Now, we have a lot of options by now. And if you want to parameterize them, well, not this one. Wow, quite a few parameters. That is another way to get parameter bloat. Now, on the implementation side, this is even more painful because the configuration command needs to be updated. You have code paths for every single setting. And well, you've got one command for one module. If you want to integrate configuration across multiple modules, you have to memorize, implement, maintain every single options command for every single module. And use the ICD script, which is not going to be all that hard on custom option functions. What we needed was configuration. Does anybody of you use Joel Bennett's configuration module? Yeah, a nifty, simple module to persist information for your module to configure it. It works quite well. But it was not versatile enough for me, so I built my own. The PowerShell Framework configuration system. First of all, the PowerShell Framework, this is my personal baby, my main project I've developed in my free time. It's a scripting framework with tools that are designed to really simplify and accelerate code deployment and development. From configuration, logging, tab completion, run space management, a lot of background features that can help you build powerful tools. Now, it's solid compliant, which means, especially for you, there will not be breaking changes. You can get it through any of these sources down below. Now, basically, how it works is you've got a name and a value pair. Think about a hash table just better. It knows literally no scopes, and it knows no run spaces. Wherever in your process you try to access the information, it will be the same. And you can have multiple sources from anywhere receive the information, and no matter where you get the information from, the configuration information, it will be transparently exactly the same for your code to use. For example, you could deploy configuration by group policy. Desired state configuration, System Center Configuration Manager, or Jenkins, Puppet. Deploy registry settings, configuration files. So, how does that work? So basically we have name, value, and this is the first part I really care about, documentation, description of what the setting does right out of the box. We've got discoverability. You can search for whatever setting happens. And that means a developer that tries to use a module from another section in the company from a fellow developer can just run get psfconfig and see what the other module or tool is going to provide as settings. It's like, think about an options module, an option setting in your application where you can just check settings. You can retrieve a specific part and you can retrieve the settings from anywhere as long as they're persisted. The setting value is set to my temp folder. We can update it. Now with set psfconfig, we can change the value, and as we see now, it was updated. And if we now start a new process, well, it's still the old setting, but I just updated the setting. By default, all settings are within your PowerShell process. They do not affect the entire environment, but you have a convenient way of registering it, and now it is for the user everywhere. So let's start it again, and now we changed it to temp, and the other process also knows this. Now, there are settings in the registry for the computer and the user. You can deploy default values, or you can deploy enforced values that the user cannot change. Meaning you can enforce settings on your users if you're trying to restrict, for example, what the help desk has access to. It's not a perfect security measure, but it will probably prevent most PowerShell neophytes from changing that. You'll have JSON files where you can store configuration, and it is compatible from PowerShell version 3 to core on Linux. Of course, compatibility with Linux has the star thingy where there's some conditions attached. Sorry. Now, this tool is designed for 4 basic scenarios. I want to manage my CI/CD deployments, and I want to manage options in a module similar to an applications module. I want to have a persistent caching function. The module can just remember specific settings across multiple iterations without the user having to interact in any way. And finally, for the regular admin, I want to have a simple way to manage certain settings for the entire enterprise without having to go back and fix individual scripts. And this is the main pain point from admin, the main pain point for me. I want each of them to be intercompatible. So if I have to use one of my company modules in my CI/CD scenario, I can plug it in and it will use the same configuration system. You only need to specify new names. So let's take a look at that. A regular script from an admin's day. Think about like a monitoring system that sends a mail message via an SMTP server. Now, in a regular script, you would instead just hardcode the mail server. And if in 2 years your mail server changes, you have to go back and fix that script. Yes. Now, at that point of time, the script has proliferated. You have hard-coded in other settings and other pieces of code somewhere. And now you have to go back and search 200, 500, 1,000 servers where you had hard-coded your mail notification. And here's the trick. They can't report they no longer work because the mail server changed. Inconvenient. Now, what this command does, it retrieves a setting named company.smtp.server. And if there is no configuration setting anywhere, instead it will use this name, which at the point of time you wrote the script is probably going to be the mail server at the time. the rest is decoration for the demonstration. So let's just execute it. We'll connect to mail1. Let's update it to smtp.beafactory.org because we want to have a good string of that. So now we change the configuration setting and it immediately knew. Again, we hit the thing, we need to make it remember that. So we update it and in this instance register it again. Yes, I should not select only a word when I run selection. And now the script will remember this. Key point here. Now, if you at a later point of time change your mail infrastructure and need to point it at a new mail server, all you need to do is push out a registry key, use a group policy or whatever client and server management tool you want, and all your scripts will immediately know the server to send mail through. All right, part 2, scenario 2, module options. Let's import my most favorite Beafactory module. And it has one configuration setting attached. Specifically, the size of your fridge, how much beer fits into your fridge, which might be of some importance to some of us, considering the drinks you have in there. So let's take a look at the actual file. This is the file that is run during module import that defines the setting. We have the module name, the name of the setting, value. Initialize is something you need to specify when you define it in a module. It's complex. Here's the next thing I wanted to solve. It has validation attached. It can tell the system you may only specify an integer in there, or you could instead demand a string, a boolean, or you could define your own validation rules. We will probably get into that later. So let's look into Nubia. And during the begin block, it will check whether the current fridge size is lower or equal the current beer count. If you already have more beer in your fridge than you can fit, it will throw a beer getting warm exception because you can't fit any more beer into the fridge, which I admit is a bit of a crisis. I'm sure you have a solution for that. So let's try something that's not going to work. We told it we want an integer, and this is not going to convert to integer. So it complains about that. Let's increase our fridge size. And again, we change the value. However, here's a key feature about the whole thing, which is one of the problems initialized solution solves. Before the module ever was imported, the setting already existed. We don't have a description, but the value is still there. We import the module, and afterwards, it updated the description, but it did not revert back to the default value. This is one of the key points initialize solves. It will also test whether the persisted value is legal. All right. NSERC Diesel scenario. My main requirement really is that the configuration is in a JSON file, part of the code repository that defines the CI/CD process, and it needs to be human readable. It needs to be clear, and I want everything in a single file, or as many files as I believe I need, but I want to have it. I want to be able to have it in a single file. Now, this is where the switch simple export comes in. By default, when you export configurate value, it uses PowerShell CLI XML serialization. Meaning if you later import it again, you get the full object with, you can sort by integer, you can use it for features that require complex objects. This is not going to be necessary in this case, so we want simple JSON so you can see the changes, track changes in source control. You can simply edit it in a notepad. So let's define a few settings. And export them to the config file. And now we have, for every setting we just defined, an entry in a JSON list, and could simply update it as we wanted to. So theoretically, this would now be the part where the CI/CD solution picks it up from where it's stored in the repository. Usually, depending on your build stage, you might want to load a different configuration file. This is the part, the decision which configuration file to import. This is the part I really can't take from you. You'll have to do that yourself. But since we just loaded it from the configuration file, it still knows the exact same values we defined and exported to the JSON. Okay. Now, the last part really is, for me, I want to be able to remember certain settings for the user automatically, transparently in the background. For example, imagine you ask the user for connection information once. Now they specify them, and you want the next time you runs your module, you want your system to remember that automatically. The user shouldn't have to do anything unless he wants to connect to a new server. So what we do in this instance, we create a few settings, and these are designed for what we automatically remember, what we automatically will load the next time. Now, since we want to manage that for the user, we want to hide it from him. He shouldn't have to deal with with this part, even if he discovers what options are available, because they're managed by the module. And this is the flag required to have it managed by the module. So if we just run get piece of config, the user doesn't see them. He has to, similar to how get child item works with force for hidden items, get piece of config works with force for hidden configuration items. So now how we use them? First, we define them. This is the part you do somewhere in your module during import. Now, after you do that, you simply call this line import psfconfig and specify the name of your module. You do not need to specify a path. You do not need to specify anything. The paths are managed for you. It will automatically import it again. Now we can use the values however we want. We just add a new value to it each time in this instance. And when we're done and want to persist the current setting, we use export psfconfig again only with the module name. In practice, this will look like that. The first time we have nothing and added a 1. And each time we run this now, it will remember what it did the last time. And remember it again. And again. Are there any questions about this entire thing so far?
Hey Fred, it's Mike. I got a couple questions.
Mike.
So in the CI/CD scenario, how do you handle encrypting variables or encrypting pieces of the the configuration, or do you just kind of abscond responsibility for that to the person who's managing it?
I do actually desist from handling encryption so far, because really I don't trust myself to have that fully securely managed. What you can do is you can store in your configuration an encrypted string and have to decrypt it again with the key, which you, in your CI/CD scenario, would pass as a protected value. For example, in Visual Studio Team Service, you would have to specify it as a protected variable in the workflow, pass it into your CI/CD script, and use that to decrypt the value. On the local host, on the interactive computer, you can persist PS credentials and load them again, and they'll be protected by user account, pretty much literally exactly as what would have happened if you had run export CLI XML on a credentials object.
Okay, that makes sense to me. So to kind of circle back a little bit, it seems like you're advocating for keeping the definition of the configuration items themselves as code in your repository. Is that right?
Yes. You can, at least that's what I'm doing so far. You can download it from elsewhere. I am going to add support for web links that you can read a web request or run a REST API and parse the received JSON as configuration.
That actually was the feature I was going to ask you to make, because that sounds really good. Okay. Does anybody else have any questions? Nope. You're good to continue.
I can continue? All right. Now that I've got covered the main use cases I care about, let's look into detail. Specifically, validation. One of the things I wanted was validation, but if I just hard-coded the options you can have the validations available, that's not going to be useful for many people. So I decided you can register a validation script log. And what it receives is the input value. Afterwards, you need to return an object that contains whether it was successful, the value, and a message. Here's the thing, the value should be the type coerced result. For example, you can demand an integer, and if the user had a string that was like a number that can safely be coerced into integer, the resultantly stored value should still be an integer, not the input type. Important, validation must not throw exceptions. So in this instance, unless you specify foo or bar, it's gonna tell it no way. Now we define the system new setting that should be using that validation. And since 42 is neither foo nor bar, it complains about that. And doesn't change it, of course. However, bar is legal, and that's that. Now, another thing the configuration can, which we absolutely didn't cover so far, is you can tie events that fire when the setting is changed. So you can define a handler event, which is a script block, and that script block will be executed on all successful changes only after validation passed. And if the handler event throws an exception, the value will not be applied. You define the setting, and it's regular. And now we'll change it to something else, and it wrote a message with the changed value in this instance, but you could use it for pretty much anything else. Important, if you deploy settings per group policy, per configuration file, or any of the other options, and after that import the module when the settings already existed, they will revalidate the persisted settings and if you persisted something that's invalid, it will throw an exception. It will refuse the change. And if the validation was successful, it will apply these change events in order to be fully consistent. Now, as I mentioned, the configuration is equally available anywhere on the process. So let's start on run space drop. That should be retrieving that value. And the separate run space where this setting was never applied knows the exactly same value. Important piece in case you use your change event to apply something. The script log is run in the run space that executed that psfconfig. So if you're changing a local variable using that, if you execute your module in a separate run space, it will not be aware of this. But other than that, you have instant access from everywhere. If you import the module in multiple times in multiple run spaces, only the first one will execute the configuration. The other module imports will silently accept them as they are and have access to them. They are not run space safe, so if you count on your code changing the settings, they might conflict. That's one of the things I didn't implement because I really don't plan for code to routinely change configuration settings at runtime except for the module cache. All right, what do I use this myself, the configuration system, for? One of the main features I use it for is my logging system. You might have noticed that I'm using write PSF message instead of something like write host, which I could have done. One of the things it does, it gives you a complete history of the messages that were written, and it does so across all run spaces. And all messages are automatically logged to a log file and will automatically be discarded after 7 days by default. Yes. So you've got automatic logging, automatic log rotate with that, and you can use policy to have change the logging parameters, whether it should log at all, whether it should log to a network path. The logging happens asynchronously in a separate run space, will flash on process end, and is plugin based. So you can specify that instead it should be logging to a RabbitMQ messaging queue. You could have it logged to AWS CloudWatch or Azure Logging provisioning, and you could deploy that as part of the configuration. So you could take a script or a module from your colleague that implements the PS framework and have his logging tie into your logging without having to change the code. You only have to change configuration. All right. If there are not any more questions, I suppose I rushed through it faster than I intended.
Hey Fred,
Okay.
could we get a look, maybe if you've got some time, at kind of the CI system in action, like if you have anything for an open source build that you could show, or some more real use cases for the cache? I think both of those things would be pretty cool to see in action.
Actually, the CI/CD I can't show because they're for customer projects. My own private CI/CD is fairly simple, actually. I only run pester tests, which I don't need to customize, so I really can't show those. The caching system I've never really had to deploy because the PS framework does not do auto caching. So I don't have that either at hand. I could ask a friend, but he's on vacation right now. But he can share his.
In that case, can you talk a little bit about some of the problems that you were solving in the CI/CD solution where you found it was necessary to use the configuration?
Actually, one of my customer projects had 12 different departments, which all had their own custom modules regarded to how they wanted events triggered for their part of the entire product, how they had to handle individual code pieces. They were using sub-modules that developers in their team were basically developing in a silo that handled sub-parts of that. This was was the place where I had this humongous command with all of these parameters. So we migrated them to use the same configuration system, and at that point they could control and they could discover the switches that were actually available from their fellow teammates and could integrate that into a central configuration for their deployments to their individual development phases, from local developer machine. They had a developer environment they would automatically deploy with on containers. Then on their testing environment, then on their QA team, and each had different configuration sets for the resource they would have access to, the permissions they were supposed to be setting. And so they were able to script that out into individual configuration files that were quite lengthy at the end of the time, at the end of things. So they usually did not change them manually, but it allowed them to fine-tune auto behavior without having to pass through variables, without having to specify parameters, dozens of them, on the command line, and they had it all in one piece.
Awesome, thanks.
It also made, at a later time, integration into one of their desktop utilities easier. They had help desk utility that was supposed to be using some, but not all, features of one of the production modules. So it simply restricted the utility they had access to by policy.
I might have missed it earlier. Can you talk a little bit about where the configuration is stored, if it's stored on disk?
If it's stored on disk, there are, on a Windows machine, free locations.
On the local computer, yeah.
On a local computer. Let me grab that. The default path is app data roaming config for the user.
Is there an option to set like a machine level config, or is it always going to be user specific?
There is a machine level setting. There are basically three paths on Windows, either on roaming, on local, which would also be Windows in Windows PowerShell PS Framework config, and the last one is in program data. So you would be placing this here. I'll need an admin console for that obviously. And I'd be placing that on file system.
Can we take a look at those scopes again? That was actually really interesting. And can you talk a little bit about what the differences are?
Beg your pardon?
Can you speak a little bit about what the differences are between the scopes? I'm not sure that everybody, well, let me rephrase that. I don't particularly know what each of those maps to.
All right. Now, file system is program data as a file. File user local would be local app data. User shared would be roaming app data. So if you've got roaming profiles, it would be the same on every machine. A system default is the default setting deployed by registry to the local computer for every user. System mandatory is also an HKLM in the registry node. However, once you set a setting to system mandatory, once you import a system mandatory setting, you can no longer change it. ZPSF-config will refuse all further changes to that setting. User default is in HKey current user, and user mandatory is in HKey current user, but again, it will refuse all further changes. On Linux, all registry nodes obviously are not available. However, they are available on PowerShell core on Windows. On Linux, I've mapped equivalent paths to the files, so you can deploy them on Linux as configuration file.
Okay, quick follow-up then for the registry ones. Since once it's loaded from mandatory, it's unable to be changed, right? So does that imply that those configs should be controlled from like your configuration management tooling?
I would recommend that. However, as far as user mandatory is concerned, a user can apply this if a module does not play nice and tries to change a setting he does not want changed.
Okay.
One thing you could be using it for in combination with the cache, if you want a specific connection to be always cached, you could register it as user mandatory. And afterwards, the caching mechanism would no longer be able to update it. So if you occasionally connect to another machine, it does not discard your default connection, your default value for that cached setting. Of course, that does not play all that nice with the caching mechanism. Another thing the mechanism supports is a version. It defaults to 1. You can increment that in case your module, a new version of your module has a breaking change where the cache is concerned. In that case, the previous version will be ignored and all the cached settings will be lost, but you don't have to deal with different values that shouldn't be there and legacy settings that should not be imported.
So real quick on that exact functionality, could I use that to kind of do a blue-green deploy of the configuration changes? So I could increment the module version and then point to that, and if I notice problems, just point back to the original conversion without having to rewrite anything on disk?
Yes, you could. However, it would require a change in the module code. Since otherwise the module will probably be overwriting the same setting, because in memory, the setting will still have the same name.
Oh, I gotcha. Okay.
Of course, you could then, let's take a look at all the properties. You could set policy enforced to true. And at that point, now it will refuse the change from the cache. So if you want to trial a specific setting that way, you could, but you'd have to enforce it if you want the module to not override it if you don't change the module code. So now if I try to update this, it refuses to change.
Very nice.
And in case you want to try catch this, you have to enable exceptions. Most of the PS framework does not implement actually enable exception, but all the user-facing that an end user is possible to interact, is likely to interact with his actual use of the module, those have enable exception as opt-in mechanism for all these warnings. And of course, the last setting is the memory. Oh, sorry. There's a utility module of mine that allows me to simply grab the last item or the first one. So anything else I can answer?
No, I think that might have been as many questions. Oh, Ken's got something.
Hey, Fred. So if there was a use case for this, and I don't know if this is something you've got built in, it looks like most of the config has to be there on the local system. Is there, unless I missed, is there any play for, because it looks like this is JSON data stored, to have this centralized somewhere, file share or something that would be configuration is stored once in one location, and then as far as I understand, we can push it out with config management and other things, but in case those systems or maturity at a shop hasn't been there yet, is there a way to, or a thought process around potentially centralizing this in one place?
Not yet. That's where the part comes in, where I'm planning to add a download capability to basically do a HTTP or REST GET on a web service and receive the config JSON directly from the web server. However, it will not automatically check for that for performance reasons. That's one of the reasons I delayed it to that point, because it would impact the average user, even if it doesn't use the feature. I am going to add that soon, because frankly the configuration system is one of the features I care most about in my entire toolkit. So you can watch out for that. What you will need is a way to tell it to look for it. Either a single setting deployed by registry or file, or by updating the module source, or I'd have to go the path of reluctantly and much against my will to go back to doing it using preference variable that your script could define, pick up your configuration from there.
Yeah, that way, if you've got something that is going to use configuration as opposed to just a normal script, that configuration script, you could put in a command or something to say, hey, look, you're going to have to go get these settings remote, go pull config remote, or something. And then it would actually go grab those configs and then be available for you.
I can see a lot of use for that at the beginning of like a scheduled task or something, like verify you have the latest settings from endpoint X or whatever.
Yeah, definitely. And then if you think about it, that remote store too, if it has a way to be able to say not only go grab the config, but this config for, like, I'm trying to equate this a little bit to some of the other config management platforms where you have the idea of environments. They don't necessarily have to be dev test prod, but go get an import or pull the configuration for this environment. Maybe you have 5 environments in your shop, maybe you have 2, but to be able to pull it from pre-prod and prod, right? And be able to say, oh, well, this system, and be able to just have that command as part of your script, something like that.
It also lets you do some of the stuff that people do with immutable deployments and changes in S3 for their Terraform stuff, right? So you stick a config up there, and then your test pipeline would run using that configuration instead of whatever you already have. And then if and only if everything passes and seems happy, you publish that, either change the DNS so that your DNS points to that endpoint now, or actually take that configuration and deploy it to your machine so it's actually local.
Yeah, that helps separate what the concerns between config and your code that's doing the change and the data that you need for the change, right? Your config versus data. So that's kind of the concept of Puppet, right? Of course, just because I have more familiarity with that, but the difference between like your higher data store and your actual component modules that you would actually use to affect change. So
and for the test, to kind of circle back to Fred's point earlier, keeping it in source control, you could point to the branch where it lives, point at the raw endpoint, and just get that plain text JSON blob back, and then use that.
Yeah.
Yes. One of the thing it already supports is importing from file system paths. Anyway, you just specify the current location and changing that to also support URIs for web server links is going to be very soon. Very soon meaning something like next week, soon.
Cool. And yeah, I was thinking something too, like, if you have a web server that's just hosting JSON, or, even in some cases where maybe that's not available yet, or something where somebody has the ability to just have that JSON. I don't know if this is necessarily a great idea or not, but in Git, if it's not sensitive data, or if it is, it's at least encrypted, but that they could pull that config right from, a GitHub repository or something like that.
On the import PSF config, can you pipe the string of the JSON through that and have that be imported?
Oh, like
straight
pipeline?
the plain JSON string.
So let's say
can you repeat the question, please?
So, for example, if I have a web page and I just tell it to go download the web page that's JSON, then pipe it in through import PSF config, that would allow me to store it on a web server where it could be accessed almost anywhere.
It can't do that yet.
Okay, so right now I can't use like standard in to pipe it a text blob, right?
Not yet, no.
Okay.
That would be a common use case for you?
It would allow me to store it somewhere central, like my GitLab server or a page on one of my servers, just to add as a central repository for that configuration. Things like, where's the mail server? I don't think anybody in the company is going to shed a tear that bad guy finds that.
Well, I can add that tonight yet. I've got the infrastructure for that.
Kind of a similar point, the being able to take it through standard in is one of the ways that a lot of people expect to be able to use those types of tools on Linux. So they'll curl an endpoint and then pipe that straight through to something else.
Right.
So
Good
in that
point.
regard, it would be a familiar workflow for people.
I'll add that. Absolutely.
I don't have any real questions left. The only thing I have left is a troll question.
Go ahead.
Why should I use this instead of the configuration module that Joel Bennett maintains?
Well, it can do pretty much anything his can, only more. Gives you more flexibility and the possibility to integrate it into other modules and scripts and workflows from other people. On the downside, of course, Joel Bennett's is simpler and he has a more easy way. This is one of the features I'm still liking. He has a more easy way to implement custom serialization in case you care about that.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
So that's a strength that I haven't yet to implement, and I'm not sure I'm going to do that. Upcoming feature from my side, I'm going to add dynamic configuration values. That allows you to specify a script block that is executed on retrieving the value. So you can, at runtime, generate the value on a per call basis.
Do you have an example use case for that?
No, I'm a feature freak. I'm doing that because I hate it. Wouldn't that be fancy? Let's see what I can do that.
My immediate thought was being able to check and change something based on whether or not it was loaded in an admin run space or not.
You certainly could be doing that.
For example, making PowerShell get actually install my modules without me having to specify scope all the time.
By the way, in case you need to mock something. We can do that as well. I mostly wrote, I just had to do that when you mentioned whether it's an elevated run space or not. I've been using that in pester tests quite a bit in order to be able to evaluate code paths more easily.
I think we're out of actual real questions at this point. I'm kind of scratching the bottom of the barrel trying to make stuff up.
Agreed. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for the many questions, the feedback. Here it is. I'm definitely going to reprioritize that.
Definitely, and thank you for presenting. Appreciate it, Fred, especially. Glad everything worked out with the remote presentation. And any final last questions? Just kind of scouring the room. Other than that, that's about it. And again, really appreciate you presenting, Fred. And this will be recorded in the next couple of days. It'll be posted up. So appreciate it.
It was a pleasure speaking with you. Hope you have a great night. Last point, in case you want to read up on anything of this, the entire configuration system is documented with code examples and everything I could think of at psframework.org.
Documentation is a plus.
I do promise to actually review this and give you decent feedback at some point in the future, Fred. Especially since you came in to do this stuff for us kind of on last notice.
Yeah, I already had that presentation worked up, so that worked out well.
I'm not going to do anything.
I'll be pushing the presentation material, the latest version, to my GitHub repository, and will be sending the link over to the meetup page on the comments. So you don't have to write down the specific links or anything. It'll all be available.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that. We appreciate that.
All right.
Go to bed, isn't it like 2 o'clock in the morning, Fred?
Well, 2.5 actually. I'm an idle. I'm used to those kind of hours.
Well, better you than us. Appreciate it, Fred. Thank you.
See you around.
Have a good night or morning, either one.
I think I'll still do a raid on my pillow, so yeah, night.
Thanks, Fred. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.